Economic trends reshaping the world. Talking Business Asia on BBC World News.
It's the biggest health and economic crisis of our generation. With a new year comes hope that a vaccine could change everything. But there's concern, too, over a new strain of the coronavirus that's led to more lockdowns.
We probably have another 6 to 9 or 12 months of this ahead of us. We must keep going and deploy the vaccine as fast and efficiently and securely as possible.
While some economies in Asia are bouncing back, possibly even stronger than before, for others, the damage has been greater than ever imagined. Welcome to Talking Business Asia. I'm Karishma Vaswani. In a moment, we'll hear more from our special guest, Laurent Boone, from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. But first, to the country where it all began. Just over a year ago, the world heard news of a mysterious virus in the Chinese city of Wuhan. Few could have predicted what happened next. China was first into the health and economic crisis, but was also the first out, and began a recovery that's now astonishing the rest of the world. Our China correspondent, Stephen McDonald, has been speaking to businesses in Beijing.
这严防控制呗，反正比你们国家强多了。
Closed. That one. Closed. Next door. Closed. Here we are. It's winter again, but now open. This one. Open. Next door. Open. Open. Totally different. So let's try and see how people's businesses are going at the moment. 那你们的生意怎么样？买得好吗？
对，可以啊。
对你们的生意乐观不乐观？
应该还行吧，这疫情不是没有了，暂时还是很好的嘛，是不是？
Let's try next door.
当然了，
是吗？
中国就这么有活力，就这么恢复那么快，对不对？不像你们国外什么不管。
是吗？
发展。
After the sun goes down, this is the time to check the pulse of the city. And it really is pumping again.
然后一般人太多地儿我们就不去了。
是吗？
对对对，上酒吧呀什么的那种场所一般就很少去了，以前去的多。
现在生意的话稍微好点，比疫情期间稍微好点。
啊，是吗？
对对对。
没有跟
里面有位置。
没有跟平常的时间一样的那么好。
对对对，没有平常时间那么好了。
差的很多吗？
差的对，差的很多。
好，你觉得得等多长时间？
现在这个咱们也不好说。
On the one hand, you've got this overwhelmingly positive feeling on the streets here. On the other, there are these businesses we've met still struggling to get back to normal. Either way, things are so much better than they were at the height of the coronavirus epidemic, and most seem to think the situation will improve even more in the coming months. Stephen McDonald, BBC News, Beijing.
Despite a new outbreak of cases in Beijing last month, China's economy does appear to be bouncing back. But that's not the case for many other countries in Asia. GDP is one way to measure economic performance. The winners, like Vietnam, China, and Taiwan, saw their economies grow in spite and perhaps because of the virus. Meanwhile, the Philippines, India, and Thailand were hardest hit. Their economies shrank last year. So what separated economies that rebounded from those who were struggling?
The most important factor in how economies have been impacted by COVID is how well they've controlled the virus domestically. So countries like China, Taiwan, Vietnam have seen very few cases relative to the rest of the world, and that's allowed life to go on largely as normal. People can go out to shops and go about their daily economic activity.
But it's not all bad news. Some countries actually benefited from COVID-related demand.
For instance, earlier on in the crisis, China, Malaysia both benefit from exports of PPE, things like face masks. Singapore benefited from a surge in exports of pharmaceuticals. And more recently, China, Korea, Vietnam have benefited from a changing consumption patterns globally, people shifting their spending from services domestically to imported goods, such as home furniture or electronics.
Lockdowns were not the only tool countries had in their arsenal. Some governments, including Australia, Singapore and Malaysia, spent big to shore up their economies. As the pandemic continues, is government stimulus the key to how these economies will fare this year? Joining me now from Paris is Laurent Boone, Chief Economist of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Good to see you, Laurent. So, is it as simple as the more money economies throw at this problem, the faster they bounce back?
Well, we're in a global crisis. We're still there, and we will still be there for most of 2021. And the tools we have to address this crisis is to shut part of the economy down. That means people having no jobs, firms having no turnover, and that requires the state to actually compensate or put these people and these firms under cocoon, so that when we can reopen the economy, our economies can rebound very, very quickly. Most countries across the globe, and that includes Asia, have done that in the first part of the crisis, and it has worked well. When their economies reopened, in the summer of last year, then they rebounded very, very quickly. This is the key for our economy to start rebounding as people and countries get out of this health and economic crisis.
But already we're hearing from countries like Singapore, they're warning that they cannot afford to spend more to help businesses to survive. What's the danger in spending so much?
So we're talking about temporary measures and a temporary increase in debt to GDP ratio. And once we're out of the crisis, where most of the production, fabric, the social, the economic fabric will have been preserved thanks to this measure, then we will have to take a step back, look at the evolution of public finances across country, and not only since COVID-19, but also since the financial crisis, and see whether this is sustainable, whether governments are spending their money on the right priorities, whether they're taxing in a progressive way.
Which countries in Asia do you think have got this mix right of spending the money where people need it at a time when this health crisis is so severe?
I don't think there is one single Asia country. Every country has managed the crisis as much as it could in sometimes different way. And nobody has got it 100% perfect. Nobody in Asia, nobody in the rest of the world. So overall, there are countries which have managed to have the lower economic shock and preserve health of their citizens. But as you can see from recent data, the evolution is the situation is very fluid. It's evolving quite quickly. So I think everybody has something to do to tackle the health crisis and then their economic growth model.
China certainly stands out as a country that's done well on both the health front and the economic front. How much has the coronavirus, in your view, accelerated China's rise in comparison to the US?
First, China was hit by the virus, as you know, earlier than most countries. So the quarter they were hit were Q1 last year, and they managed to get out of it. Now, China is relying on traditional engines of growth, which the OECD for years has said they must evolve. China is relying on exports and investment by the public sector, state-owned enterprises into infrastructure that are not always very productive. For the growth in China to be sustainable, it needs to move to a more consumption-driven growth, to a more services-driven growth. And this is not happening. So China has also a lot of work to do on this side.
Hold that thought, Laurent. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll hear whether the vaccine rollout will inject new life into Asia's economies.
In the world of business, everything is connected. From global hubs to places less traveled. The big stories to your bottom line. The path can be unpredictable. But with the right insights, you can see where the bend in the road will lead. Business on BBC News. Make the connection.
I'm Katty Kay from BBC News and I'm based in Washington.
And I'm Carlos Watson from Aussie Media, journalist and entrepreneur.
Together, we'll bring you the ideas that are reshaping America.
Conversations on a country undergoing change.
For a fresh perspective.
A new weekly podcast, When Katty Met Carlos.
Welcome back to Talking Business Asia. I'm Karishma Vaswani. We've been looking at how economies in Asia dealt with the coronavirus. Locking down fast seemed to be the key to success for some. But what about countries that did lock down early and still failed to control the disease? Nikhil Inamdar has this report from India.
This was the defining image of India's COVID response. Millions of migrant workers fleeing cities on foot and walking days to reach their villages hundreds of miles away as the country went into a lockdown with just 4 hours' notice in March. 9 months later, many have had no choice but to return to the city. Unlike before, they're now barely making ends meet. Reval Gupta, who sells betel leaf on the street in central Mumbai, is one of them.
It took me 6 days initially on foot, then on the back of a water tanker and a bus to reach my village in Jharkhand. There was tremendous hardship. I did swift business of 4,000 to 5,000 rupees before the lockdown, but now that I'm back, I barely make 1,000 to 1,200 rupees a day.
Gupta's story is illustrative of the uneven nature of India's post-lockdown recovery. While some parts of the economy have seen a sharp rebound, car sales are up and factories are producing more goods, some haven't. Many workers have lost their jobs and low wages have been driven down even lower. India's growth had seen a sharp slowdown even before the pandemic hit, and the virus has now left a deep scar that's unlikely to fade anytime soon. Those most affected are in the country's vast informal sector, which accounts for half of India's GDP and employs 9 out of 10 workers.
Workers in the informal sectors have been hit a lot more than formal sector workers, so the gap between the have and the have-nots might actually widen in this particular cycle. This is important because it does mean that the durability of the cycle is sort of on shaky foundations.
Stimulus measures to boost the economy, less than 2% of GDP, have been among the smallest in comparison to other major global economies. The government has provided little relief to people like Reval, who's now struggling to pay rent for his little street-side business. All hopes are now pinned on a vaccine. How quickly India can vaccinate its 1.3 billion people will ease the strain of the pandemic, but it's not a cure for the ailing economy. Nikhil Inamdar, BBC News, Mumbai.
Let's bring in Laurent Boone, the chief economist for the OECD. Laurent, as you heard from our reporter there, India was one of the countries hardest hit, but now a vaccine is on the way. How much will vaccines boost growth prospects, do you think, for other countries, and which economies are likely to fare the best out of this?
For economies to start rebounding and gaining momentum again, what we need is people to be able to move, firms to be able to operate. So as the vaccine everywhere gets more widely distributed and deployed, then we'll be able to actually reopen the economy more fully. So that's super important that it proceeds as fast as possible given each country's individual circumstances. But it's definitely a tremendous news that we do have this and that we'll be managing to reopen the economy. Now, India is a very large economy. We've seen that it's been difficult actually to implement non-pharmaceutical measures because there's a lot of informal work, for example, and people need to get out to earn a living. It will be super important to deploy this vaccine well into the country and to ensure that it reaches the maximum number of people necessary for people to go freely around and start operating businesses as before.
How soon, though, do you see a recovery in some of the hardest hit countries like India, the Philippines and Indonesia, for instance? And what does this depend on?
The strength of the rebound will obviously depend on how fast the countries can get immune with the vaccine and how good was the protection before. It also depends on the sector composition. So we need, I think, a couple of things. First is continue with non-pharmaceutical measure as much as possible to preserve the health of people, deploy the vaccine very quickly, protect people and firms at the same time, and restore confidence all the way through. It's been amazing to see how much confidence has collapsed with this crisis. And this needs to be restored for people to start consuming again, for businesses to invest again. We need confidence for people to travel and get to the country. It will be also important on the other side of Asia, in Japan, for example, for the Olympics to be a success. So I think a very structured health strategy with vaccine deployment and keeping or rebuilding confidence thanks to not only health but also economic policy measures will be the key to a faster rebound everywhere.
There are now fresh lockdowns as a result of the new strain of the virus in many parts of the world. How does that risk economic recovery going forward?
So it's obviously a hit on some economies that were already weakened by the first phase of the crisis, which is why it's super important to actually keep government support going. With the vaccine, we know that there is hope, that there is some light at the end of the tunnel. What governments have to do, is navigate those waters with partial confinement throughout the period during which there is vaccination and we're building some immunity. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying we've seen that it worked in 2020. We probably have another 6 to 9 or 12 months of this ahead of us. We must keep going, both with the non-pharmaceutical measures, confinement, the government support, and deploy the vaccine as long and efficiently, as fast and efficiently and securely as possible.
So the picture you're painting, Laurent, is one of more social distancing, more lockdowns, more government support. And this is even when we have the distribution of a global vaccine. So how is 2021 different from 2020?
I think it's very different because we have this hope. In 2020, we had research on the vaccine. Now the vaccine is being manufactured. It's the first time in history that we get something like that fast. But it's logistically something complicated to manage to vaccine, 7 billion of people on Earth.
As economies do start to recover, what, in your view, is the biggest threat to this recovery?
This crisis has been terrible in an additional sense we haven't discussed yet, which is it has widened inequality, right? People catching the most the virus are the poor. people who are the most difficult to protect because they work, it's informal jobs, or they work in the tourism sector, or they work in the art, leisure sectors. All those people have been the most hurt by the confinement measure, and they're the ones who usually are the less qualified and the youngest. So we're going to see some widening of inequality that may, fuel populist resentment in some places. So I think from a political economy standpoint, it will also be a very difficult period ahead, and governments will have to think hard about how to reduce these inequalities and raise the opportunity and growth benefits for all.
How prepared is the world for another virus?
So I think the world is now prepared to make sure that it will be prepared for another virus. We've seen some parts of the world were better prepared than others, but everybody was hurt terribly. We've also seen how connected we are. I think we urgently need to take lessons from this COVID crisis for more possible pandemic and be much better prepared next time.
Laurent Boone there from the OECD. The pandemic has forced many of us to change how we work, whether it's working from home, learning new skills, or transforming our businesses. I met some companies in Singapore doing precisely that. And a warning, this story contains flashing images. Burning calories on bikes instead of the dance floor. This used to be the playground of Singapore's Young and Glamorous, one of Southeast Asia's best-known clubs. These days, same venue, but a very different scene. Zouk is one of hundreds of nightclubs and restaurants in Singapore that were forced to shut because of the pandemic lockdown. It had to let go a quarter of its staff and reinvent itself.
It's almost that point where you kind of get backed against the wall, right? And you have to think something different and outside the box. I think it's still a mere fraction of what we did in I think nightlife, when it does well, it does extremely well. My main priority at this point in time was really to keep the livelihoods and the jobs of the staff together.
Where some businesses found opportunities in cycling, others had to move out to get on their road to recovery. Before the pandemic, this tour company used to arrange bike rides for international travelers visiting Singapore to show them the sights and sounds of this city. But when borders closed, Robin Lowe's business dried up, and he had to find a new way to stay afloat.
We used to be doing a lot of foreign tourists, so they were usually from US, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. When COVID hit us, we had zero business. What I told my team is that let's concentrate on doing whatever we can for local tourism.
Robin now helps locals get to know their own country, taking them for scenic rides on Singapore's backwaters. This country spent $70 billion subsidizing businesses, and like many others, he benefited from that. But that help won't last forever.
We cannot continue this very, very large infusion of government resources indefinitely. The businesses which are able to resume should resume. The businesses which need to transform or to pivot to a new orientation because it's a new normal and the old way of doing things won't work anymore. We will help you to do that.
Punching through the pandemic is the ultimate balancing act. Until economies reach a new normal, it's an uphill battle just to survive. Well, that's it for this edition of Talking Business Asia. I'm Karishma Vaswani. From me and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.
Hello there. We'll take a look at the weather picture across the United States first of all. And we've got a little weather system bringing